Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to the conference today. My name's Christine Abbott, and I'm from the Centre for Action Learning here in the UK. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the international trends and applications of action learning that are around at the moment and are developing at the moment. It's quite a complex area. But I just thought I'd remind you what Revans talked about on action learning and how he saw action learning. He didn't define it very often in words, but this is one of his descriptions, which I think is very apt and shows how the action learning has developed over the years. So he said the central idea of this approach to human development at all levels, in all cultures and for all purposes, is today that a set or a small group of comrades in adversity strive to learn with and from each other as they confess their failures and expand their victories. So I think key here is the all cultures. So we're going to see varieties of action learning across different cultures and for all purposes. So even though he was writing this in 1980, all these years later, we still see the relevance of action learning. And this principle that it's a small group of people, all who are equal, all who have a challenge, and they strive to learn with each other and from each other, both from challenges, but also from things that went really well. And often action learning is seen as a problem-solving tool rather than just learning from the things that go exceedingly well. There are different trends around, and I'm going to start with conventional action learning, just as a way of grounding us in what is known as a sort of the basic standard conventional action learning, which is still very much the main action learning methodology that's used across the world, particularly in the UK. Linked to that is gold standard action learning. That's a very specific piece of research that was done by Verna Willis some years ago that linked the conventional action learning with the gold standard for action learning, some very specific principles. We're also going to look at business-driven action learning, again, still derived some years ago, but is still a very popular method of action learning, particularly in the United States. It's still one of the key areas of action learning. And also socially driven action learning. So these are all context. In green, they're all context areas of action learning, whether in a specific context. So socially driven action learning, it has a relationship with business driven action learning, but as it said, it's more in the social environment and is particularly common in Europe and the UK. And then we have the types of action learning. So reflection action learning, South American origin, also in Scandinavia, a particular type of action learning. Knowledge fusion action learning, which is used in academia. Virtual action learning, of course, has become much more prominent since the pandemic, but has been around for a long, long time. Critical action learning was a very popular method of looking at action learning some years ago, possibly also more in an academic environment, but still is a method that's around, as is positive action learning, a minor deviation, I suppose you call it in action learning terms, but has been used a lot in Africa. Coaching action learning, and another variant of action learning. American action learning, where the facilitator is called a coach and is very dominant in an action learning set and leads the set. Self-managed action learning is the opposite. and that is certainly on the rise, particularly in Europe and in Australia, where sets are taught to manage themselves rather than having a facilitator. And another very new method of action learning is eco-action learning, or eco-driven action learning. And that's predominantly because of the rise in organizations' need to prove themselves as sustainable. A lot of the standards that organizations need to meet now involves sustainability in order to be in the world market. And another method, which has been around for some time, but is definitely gaining momentum in the world, is relational action learning. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. The sort of link to that is networked action learning. Again, a more sort of specialist area of action learning. Is still around. It's been around for a while and is still around. Those that I put in bold are ones I'm going to be describing a little bit more, because they are certainly those that are the most predominant in the world of action learning and are on the rise in terms of methodologies. So we're going to start off with conventional action learning, because it is the basic version of action learning, the one that most people know. It tends to be multi-problem action learning, but could be in one organization. So typically one organization, typically people bring their own individual challenges to the set. Might be, how can I implement a new development-focused appraisal system? Somebody else might come along and say, well, how do I merge two organizations or two departments into one? Programs typically take 6 to 12 months, with people meeting every 6 weeks, sometimes for a day, sometimes 3 hours, depending on the number of people in the set. It usually, people have the capacity and the power to implement changes in the workplace themselves. So it's not a like business-driven action learning where people make recommendations. This is actually where they actually do something. They have the power to make it happen, because that classical definition of action learning, it involves learning from the attempt to change things in the workplace. So if you can't change anything in the workplace, then conventional action learning would say this isn't action learning. The people involved tend to be managers. It was developed with managers in mind. Indeed, Revans described it as the best way to educate managers. And it's because of this relentless focus on real problems in real time, and with practitioners who have that capacity and capability to do something about it as decision makers in their organizations. The distinctiveness, well, this is the key for action learning. This is the most basic. So therefore, it's sort of the standard approach, and all of the other methods that I'm going to talk to you about, I'll talk about why they're different, using conventional action learning as the basis for the discussion. So business-driven action learning I'll use next. It's been around for quite some time now. It was an approach that was used by companies, or designed to be used by companies, to engage their people in exploring and resolving challenges and opportunities, whilst at the same time developing their leadership skills. It integrates aspects of sort of project management with traditional action learning. So the typical challenges that you would see addressed were, how do we stimulate innovation in our organization? How do we accelerate growth in a mature market? Also the key future trends. How do we get to the future first? So very business driven in the way that they tackle problems. The length of time, it can take a long time for this to develop, and usually the programs will last up to 2 years, which sounds an awfully long time. And that's because it's got some key milestones within it and different activities and patterns. So usually there are residential elements in this. So people meeting together to work on the business challenge over a number of set times over the period, sometimes 3 or 4 3-day events. And these events include outside, inside visits. So going and visiting other organizations, other companies, seeing how they do things, finding out, researching, and also sometimes having expert input, which is part of the whole leadership development aspect of it. Many are global, with global companies, so they may well include some cultural elements. So going to cultural events or buildings or theatre to understand the culture that people operate in. The action learning sets happen between these residential periods, and that's about their own personal challenge in undertaking the project. The output is always a set of recommendations for senior leaders. So they're not people, this isn't different from the conventional action learning where people take action. Here they make recommendations from the 2 senior leaders about that challenge of stimulating innovation or accelerating growth in a mature market. They're making the recommendations, they're not actually doing anything. And that's why it takes so long. So you're looking at about 20 to 28 days on the programme in total. It does mean a lot of input from very senior managers as they define what the challenges are. And sponsorship, therefore, is absolutely key to making this a success. If we go to socially driven action learning, again, it's an approach, as you could probably guess, it's about communities engaging in the exploration of social challenges that affect communities, again, and enhancing their leadership capabilities at the same time. But it's about creating experience-based learning systems for community where social action is the end result. So it could be about, I don't know, stimulating employment for people traditionally who are not in employment. It could be addressing homelessness. It could be addressing drug or alcohol abuse in city centres. So they're multi-stakeholder problems, multi-organisational problems. In general, it's again, it's a fairly long process. It can take up to 2 years. Most of the ones I've been involved in have been 12 months, but it can take longer. There are some very specific things that happen in a socially driven action learning programme in terms of the distinctiveness. So it's distinctive in the sense that it has a lot of stakeholders. So if you're going to address homelessness in a city, then it's not just one thing. It's not one organisation. It's a variety of organisations, and even the people who are homeless, who this affects directly, would be involved in the action learning sets. So it could be local government, it could be police, it could be hospital services, specific services for that client group as well as the clients. So it's a multi-stakeholder action learning set. Usually it starts with a large group event, usually one day, which maps out the whole problem. So it's a one problem action learning set. It maps out, this large event maps out, and there are techniques that you can use like complexity mapping to do that. And then followed by face-to-face action learning sets to address those topics that have emerged from the mapping. So that typically a set will consist of that range of stakeholders that we talked about before, and some support workers sometimes to ensure that everybody is able to take part. So the output of this particular programme is likely to be anything from a project plan to recommendations to a funding body or to a sponsor, although it could carry on in order to be able to implement the output as well if those recommendations are accepted. The people who are involved in this, well, they tend to be the people who either use the service or could be potential users of the service. And it means that the facilitators have to be particularly skilled in working with those diverse groups, of course, particularly if you're dealing with people who have a long-term health condition or who are homeless, for example. So the challenge is defined through a piece of research often, or a particular social concern. Complexity mapping maps the environment with the whole group, then the action learning sets, often bringing action learning sets together as a midterm event, and then the implementation part of the programme. So a very complex programme to run, and does need some very specialist skills in order to be able to do it. Eco-driven action learning is relatively new and is becoming more and more and more important in the world, and more important in terms of organisations. So this is almost becoming very quickly similar to business-driven action learning and conventional action learning. And that's driven by the need for organisations globally to demonstrate their sustainability credentials in order to win contracts. So a lot of organisations wanting to show that they meet the standards for sustainability in order to win contracts globally. And certainly in Europe, this is becoming more and more so, that it doesn't matter what sort of level of contract you have to demonstrate that you have sustainability built in, that you're caring for the environment, that you make sure your processes and policies that you use are sustainable. So this type of action learning is designed to support that drive towards meeting sustainability and environmental standards. It's hard to say how long it takes, because it takes as long as it takes, and it can be a very long journey to get from where an organisation is to where it needs to be to meet those standards. So it's hard to decide what it is, but I would say typically around 6 months to 12 months. The output of it would be an audit of the organisation, and also the ability to apply for the environmental standards and sustainability standards in order to be able to contract with organisations and sell products in various markets. That would be the final output. The process to getting to that output, first of all, would be a 360 audit of the organisation to find out where they stand at the moment and where they might improve. And we have a particular process for that. And Michael, who's with us today, will be able to tell you a little bit more about that. But we So it starts off from a very firm research into the organisation with a project plan. And it's the action learning sets actually work on that project plan. So they take the plan and they start to develop and work with it in order to be able to meet those standards. So it could be an organisation meets it in 2 or 3 areas, but needs to help and support in just one other. So that's where the action learning set would really fit in. The people that's involved, clearly they need to be people who can make those changes and be able to develop the plan and put things into action. So they're likely to be more senior people, although there are times when you would have a much wider audience in the organisation, or even maybe in the sector that they work in order to develop those ideas. I guess that in terms of distinctiveness, it is a process. So it starts with a real strong purpose to develop a sustainable organisation, to meet the standards, environmental standards that are required. It may need a lot of expert input. So, for example, waste management, it may need a specialist to come in and sort that part of the challenge out. And then it's got this action learning set that is really managing that project all the way through and ensuring the purpose is correct. So they're going to be a multiple group of people doing that, and could be external stakeholders as well. So it's very organizational output driven rather than personal learning. It has a very strong output in terms of the organization. Knowledge fusion action learning is very much one that was developed in academia, and it's used in management development predominantly as part of perhaps a master's degree, that type of program. It combines traditional education programs with that are more in the mainstream of management development, to look at developing explicit knowledge, but then uses action learning to share tacit knowledge from people's real and lived experience. It's usually part of a post-experience or a postgraduate program. So we're looking at maybe 12 to 18 months with sets meeting regularly as part of a curriculum. So it's built in as part of the curriculum, and can meet weekly or fortnightly for around a couple of hours. The output is usually, I mean, there's a formal academic output, such as, sort of academic credit, master's degree, all of the things that are associated with a assessed piece of work. But it's also about real world. So most people who do this knowledge fused action learning are on master's programs or post-experience master's programs. So people who are senior managers in an organization doing a part-time master's degree. So they're building organizational change programs into the whole piece of the whole program, where they're using action learning as part of it. In terms of its distinctiveness, it's about basing research, managerial and industry focus together. It brings in academic qualifications, which is very unique to action learning. Members are not always going to be working in one small set of 6, and there's no compulsion as to where a member's interest might take them. So it may be that people move from different sets, which is again very different to a traditional action learning set. Action reflection learning, again, this has been around for quite some time, but I've put it in here because it's very distinctive in terms of where it's predominantly used, which is in Sweden and South America. And it's about, the focus is helping people become better learners, managers to become better learners through reflection, testing assumptions, questioning, by solving real organizational problems. So it's very much a personal development methodology. It blends set work with experiential learning and one-to-one coaching. So it's only, action learning is only one part of the whole program. A bit like American action learning, the learning coach is central to the process because they link the set work together with the one-to-one coaching. So they hold it together in a very structured way. Very good for preparing young talent or developing mentoring programs or developing really high performance teams. It can last over 12 months, again, very typically. People tend to meet for 4 5-day groups in sessions. So rather than meeting once every 6 weeks, they'll meet every quarter, but for 4 or 5 days. And it'll be this mix of management exercises, action learning sets, coaching, all mixed in together. So it's quite an intensive process. The executive team are likely to be the people who are involved from the top because they're going to set some of the challenges for participants. As I said, the action learning coaches play a very important part in this process, helping the executive choose the most appropriate projects for participants to work on. Facilitators in this type of program are usually organizational psychologists because they are doing lots and lots of one-to-one feedback. The output of the program is going to be an assessment of personal development. There will be a completion of an organizational task, but the primary purpose is this assessment of personal development. So the distinctiveness is about, yes, people do an investigation into an organizational challenge that's set by the organization. They learn from the taking of action, but it includes psychometric testing, expert input, one-to-one coaching input, and is usually in residential blocks. So it's got a very different feel to a traditional action learning set. Virtual action learning, as I said right up at the front, has really taken over in recent years because of the pandemic. 3 years ago, I just said its most useful part was if you worked in a global organization covering many, many different countries, and it was the only way to get people together. Of course, now that's changed, and it's certainly across Europe, and America, it's certainly been used more and more by people who work in the same town, and that's because of the various lockdowns that we've undergone. So usually made up of dispersed structures or remote working arrangements, but now more so in more conventional settings. Synchronous action learning is where you bring people all together in the same time and the same time frame. Asynchronous means that you're operating across different times. So they're slightly different. So synchronous, conference call, we all get together in one place at the same time. Asynchronous is where you might do it through a forum, where somebody writes down a challenge in the forum, people then ask questions, and at the end of a set period of time, the person answers those questions. So it's done over a period of usually a week. So say a Monday, somebody posts a question, Then people ask questions from Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and on Friday, the person reviews the questions and answers them. So similar, both virtual, but they have a different methodology for practicing it. Very similar to traditional action learning. People work for maybe up to 12 months, usually 4 to 6 monthly meetings, or 4 to 6 meetings, I should say, over that year, so monthly to 6 weeks. It's a different way of facilitating it. You need more time so that people can focus, and it needs higher levels of concentration, for example. So they tend to be shorter. So whereas a face-to-face action learning set may be 3 hours to a day, virtually 2 hours, probably maximum. The output, again, it can be either individual or it can be single problem. This is the way it's delivered. It's using technology more than anything else. So everything else is fairly much the same in terms of the problem. Is very similar to conventional action learning. The only distinctiveness is that this is done in a virtual environment, so either synchronously or asynchronously. Self-managed action learning, I guess Revans might say this would be the ultimate type of action learning. You don't need a facilitator or a guide on the side, as he called it. It can be that groups can self-manage their own processes, and this is becoming very much the norm now in the UK. So facilitators there to set up the program, make sure the conditions are right, make sure the materials are there, maybe sitting with the group for the first few meetings to guide them before they go into a self-managed situation. So the key values that underpin this approach are very much about empowerment, people being committed to learning, and a more facilitative management style than a directive one, which again is becoming a much more common management style in Europe specifically. The challenges can be the same as any other action learning set. It could be one problem, it could be multi-problem. Again, it tends to be 6 people meeting regularly, and the time and the duration, of course, with it being self-managed, is determined by the set members themselves, not by anybody else. So conventional action learning, I would set up a program and say, right, every 6 weeks on a Monday afternoon, we're going to meet for 2 hours. In a self-managed set, the facilitator right at the beginning would help the group decide when they're going to meet, for how long, where they're going to meet. Could be virtual, could be face-to-face. Tends to be for managers rather than other groups of people, although we're working with lots of groups of professionals at the moment, and they're working in self-managed sets. They're not people who've got management responsibilities. What's interesting, though, it does that one of the outputs, which is different to other forms of action learning, is that people do learn about facilitating. They learn about a more facilitative management style because they're working in this very collaborative setting. They learn a lot of skills. So not only are they resolving the challenges and the problems in the workplace, but they're developing a set of facilitation skills themselves. So what's different about this approach is that most of all of the other processes that we've looked at so far and are about to look at in the next methodology I'm going to show you, facilitators are involved to some degree or another, either very dominant in terms of business driven or action reflection learning, or perhaps less dominant, but still present. Self-managed action learning, there isn't a facilitator after the first few meetings. It's designed to strengthen that sort of facilitative management style, which the others are not. The last one I wanted to talk to you about is relational action learning. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about this is because in one of the next seminars, you'll have the founder of relational action learning coming to talk to you, a colleague of mine called Tom Boydell. This is a particular approach when people are not unrelated. So you may get a group of people who work together regularly. Now, they could be across organizations or they could be within an organization. Because the key thing is that they do have strong working relationships or interdependent connections with each other. It may be that every stakeholder has their own perspectives or interests or practices or etc. But they still have this connection. They're working on things together. So project teams might be a good example for this. So it's useful with project teams. It's useful with particularly cross-organizational or interdepartmental projects. It's not so much a method or a strategy. So it's hard to say how long it's going to take, but it tends to be longer than traditional action learning, because there are other issues, other activities that happen alongside it. So I'll talk about in a moment. The output might be recommendations, or it could be action itself. Most often, because it's a project one, it's a action which is done collectively. Everything moves forward at the same time, unlike conventional action learning where people have different ways of doing things at different times. So it's likely to be all move along at the same time, whether that's in a report, recommendations, or in action. The most distinct thing about it is that this work-based relationship, so people having that work-based relationship, they may bring their own problem in relation to the major project, but they have a connection. All these issues that they bring are connected by the one project. The other part about it is that there are aspects of the whole process that are different. So they're likely to do things like biography work, network analysis, complexity mapping, wickedness monitors, a way of deciding how difficult or complex an issue is. There is something called a wickedness monitor that facilitators are trained to use. There could be talk time, World Cafe processors that are used. So it uses a lot of large scale and small scale interventions, which makes it a little bit different to other types of processes that we've looked at. Facilitators need a lot of techniques available to them in order to be able to manage this type of action learning. And they'll need some primary research skills as well, because a lot of it is around writing up the notes and writing up observations and presenting them back to the group. So there's some skills in facilitating this that are outside the normal action learning skills. And as I say, I wanted to finish on that one because one of your next seminars will be hearing the originator of this particular approach speaking directly to it. So I hope that whistle-stop tour around the world and whistle-stop tour around some of the trends that are around at the moment in terms of action learning and where it's going, from that conventional action learning and taking a tour around how it's used in businesses, how it's used in community settings, how it's used in order to be able to drive and accredit sustainability, how it's used for personal development, organizational development, project development, how it's used in a virtual setting, face-to-face setting. I hope that's interested you, and I look forward to all the questions, no doubt, that you have about all of those. So for now, thank you.